understanding terrorism and how it can be defeated. So, exactly 50 years after the surprise attack that led to the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Israel was attacked on two fronts by both Egypt and Syria and was almost overwhelmed, choosing their most holy day, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, when they were at minimum deployment, at most distracted on a holiday where they had the lowest amount of alertness possible. It's happened again exactly 50 years later. Military intelligence didn't see it coming. The military was totally unprepared. They were overwhelmed, and extraordinary scenes that nobody expected to ever see. And just as the deal of the century, as they called it, was about to be finalized between Israel and Saudi Arabia, where they would normalize relationships and form a common front against Iran, and this was something which saw as mutually beneficial, at Iran being a common threat, Saudi Arabia and Israel as two massive military forces would form a common pact, and now this has been completely and utterly derailed, because Iran is the biggest common threat to both Israel and Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia cannot now be seen to be having a normal relationship with Israel or signing any kind of mutual defense or economic pact, while Israel's fighting back against Hamas and Palestinians are dying. So the surprise terror attack by Hamas has derailed the peace accord and the planned normalization agreement. Interesting timing, that. And it's ensured an intensified war, which I'm sure has had the arms manufacturers industry thrilled that there's now another cause for massive amounts of debt to be engineered while they sell more and more of their weapons. As Romans 3 says, their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Hamas started this war by murdering civilians, taking dozens of hostages into Gaza, perhaps over 100 hostages, human shields as hostages taken, kidnapped back. And there was a trance party, a psychedelic drug trance party in the Negev desert, where they had a massive statue of Buddha that they were trance dancing around. And into this event came these motorized paragliders, machine gunning up these partygoers, and at least 260 of these trance psychedelic drug partygoers were wiped out in one day at this Negev desert party. And Hamas fired thousands of rockets into the state of Israel. And it massively overwhelmed the Iron Dome countermeasures, which just couldn't cope with the sheer quantity of rockets pouring in. And Gaza has been the scenes of extraordinary excitement and enthusiasm as these people who have voted for Hamas time and again. Since 2007, Hamas has been consistently elected as the government of Gaza. And the excitement over seeing rockets launched into Israel and hostages taken, people killed, civilians killed. And I don't know what they think is going to happen next, because Hamas started this war, but Israel is determined to finish this war. And Israel's got a phenomenally large army, a major amount of weaponry, and they get $3 billion of weaponry free every year from the United States of America, not counting the billions they get from Germany, not counting the huge amounts of other aid they get. But Israel's got a magnificent air force and one of the largest tank forces in the world, over 3,000 tanks, very advanced tanks at that. And their navy is also quite significant. And they have pulverized the Gaza Strip as anticipated in retaliation. At least 85 apartment blocks leveled in the last few days since the attacks on Saturday the 7th. Not Saturday the 7th, since Friday the 7th. Friday the 7th, the attacks began, as the Sabbath began. The Israeli Sabbath, that is. And the precision-guided missiles, the drone strikes and others. So Hamas started the war. Israel's determined to finish it, and caught in the middle of the ordinary people of Israel and Palestine. And the Gazans are going to pay for the actions of Hamas. And you just think how there was a peace accord at one stage between the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, who used to run the Gaza Strip, and the President of Israel. And immediately after that, Hamas rose to the fore. Hamas dates basically from the time of the peace accords, which got Yasser Arafat the Nobel Peace Prize, because Hamas was no negotiations with Israel, extinction for Israel, no two-state solution, just extinction for the state of Israel. So Hamas has grown out of the failure of the PLO to carry the war further. So the question is, how is Hamas financed? And Indian Frontline investigations has come up with interesting facts. The United States President Joe Biden has released over $6 billion to Iran. And Iran has supplied $1.8 billion to Hamas. So who's funding this war? Biden may have said, we've got Israel's back and we are going to do whatever's got to be done. But they're financing both sides of this war. And Hamas is getting every single month $20 million more from Qatar. And Qatar is another major American ally. And America pours in all kinds of investments and aid into Qatar and works together with them on a whole lot of things. In fact, Qatar launched ISIS under the inspiration of the Obama government. And Joe Biden, when he was vice president, had to admit to Congress, yes, we did start ISIS. And an American general also admitted, America started ISIS. They got Qatar to put up the first 500 million. And Ambassador Stevens, the same one who got murdered by Islamic militants in Benghazi, was the bagman who carried the first 500 million to ISIS and got them started. And Qatar continues to supply Hamas with $20 million a month. So Qatar is funding Hamas terrorists, without a shadow of a doubt. Hamas also collects $27 million in taxes from the Palestinian people in Gaza, thanks to the Palestinian people voting them in as their government. So Hamas they might be a terrorist organization, but they've also got political clout, and they walk around collecting tax from people door to door, and it's very hard to renege on paying your taxes when the people doing the tax gathering are carrying AK-47s. US ally and NATO member Turkey also supports Hamas enormously. Erdogan of Turkey is an enthusiastic supporter of Hamas and has gone on record supporting what they've been doing now. The latest take of hostages, killing of civilians, butchering babies, they're all on board for that. And why would they not? Turkey murdered, after all, 1.5 million Christian Armenians in 1915, and a whole lot of Greeks. They wiped out the largest Christian city in Asia, Smyrna, back in 1923. So Turkey is fully supportive. So why is Turkey an American ally? When America says we've got Israel's back and we're on their side and we oppose terrorism, but they're funding the very people who are funding the terrorists. Also bear in mind, the Hamas leaders live abroad. They don't live in Gaza Strip. So they live in luxury in Turkey and Qatar, and they live in 5-star luxury. They've got extraordinary expensive lifestyles, caviar and the best cars, and you name it. And you can see some of these Hamas characters taking part in golf tournaments in Qatar, and you name it. It's quite sickening. If you want to see this sort of thing, it's all there on social media. But they don't suffer the consequence of their policies. It's not the same as, if you are leading the people, you should actually lead them, like be with them. If there's consequences, the leader should get the consequences, the same policies he's initiated. But no, they don't. Hamas has 30,000 terrorist jihadists. 30,000. Now that's not much, considering Israel's got 1.8 million if you count all their reservists. And Israel's just called up 300,000 more reservists for what must be coming, probably a major ground offensive on Gaza. So Hamas has got a significant force, but it's not enough to take on the IDF. They've got an arsenal of 7,000 rockets, and they must have fired about 5,000 of them already in this fight. They have 300 anti-tank missiles, which will be very significant if Israel starts to come into the Gaza Strip. And Iranian advisors help to train Hamas fighters, doubtless benefiting from the generosity of Biden, who's been funding Iran so nicely. So these Hamas fighters, they don't lack for good weapons. Look at this kind of do-it-yourself terrorist kit. RPG, carried a nice sling bag, which got every kind of high explosive and fragmentary type of rockets that they can use in the RPG, which is a Soviet and Chinese improvements on the German Panzerfaust that was being used in the Battle for Berlin in 1945, which took out a lot of T-34 tanks. But these RPG-7s are very easy to operate. I've fired them myself. Very user-friendly. You don't need to be very intelligent to be able to handle an RPG-7, and they're phenomenally effective. And one RPG-7 can knock out the average tank. And they can cause a lot of damage in buildings and so on too. Now, there's all kinds of rockets available on both sides. Israel is certainly under fire. The timing of this is also interesting. Benjamin Netanyahu, who's considered a conservative right-winger in Israel, has been under a lot of political attack, but this military attack has put even his opponents on his side. So whenever Israel's physically attacked, the people tend to come together politically, and so it's something of a blessing in disguise, if you want to put it that way, for Benjamin Netanyahu, in that he's suddenly solved a lot of his political problems just like that overnight. Suddenly all the divisions are gone and the people are behind him. So Israel is responding as one would expect, with pulverizing a Gaza Strip. They say they are targeting Hamas homes, Hamas workplaces, places where they coordinate, and where they have their weapons depots, and where they have their rockets. But of course that's exactly where the hostages are taken as human shields. So Israel must know that they are endangering their own people in this. And of course there are a lot of civilian casualties. So apparently Israel sends cell phone messages to the people in the area: your block of flats is about to be demolished and things like this, and you must get out. And so there is warnings being given, assuming people are paying attention to it. And yet, where do they flee to? Gaza Strip is one of the most overpopulated sections in the world. It's like one big concrete jungle. So again, a ground offensive going into Gaza Strip is going to be quite a mess, because it's just urban warfare, like Stalingrad type of thing. And 85 apartment blocks have already been leveled in Gaza since the Hamas attack on the state of Israel. And this is to be expected, because Hamas positions themselves in and around the civilians. Now, Hamas, being typical terrorists, they like to parade the civilians who get killed afterwards, but they won't let the civilians move out of the areas. They will position their rockets where there's a school. They'll position the operational and the munitions supplies in highly dense population areas, so that they can say, you are responsible for killing the civilians that we positioned ourselves amongst while we're shooting rockets into your territory, for the express purpose that we can then blame you for the deaths of the people that we put in the line of fire. Now, we also should notice the historic significance. People should remember Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat was president of Egypt, and he led Egypt in its most successful military attack in Yom Kippur 1973, which almost defeated Israel and put Israel in a very difficult position. And at that point afterwards, he made peace with Israel. And because of him making a peace deal with Israel, he was targeted for assassination by his own people, the Muslim Brotherhood. During the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War in 1991, Muslim Brotherhood soldiers of his came off their vehicles as they came past the presidential box and machine gunned to death the president and a whole lot of delegations. And his killers chose this anniversary military parade and literally started just throwing hand grenades into the presidential box and machine gunning the president and his entourage. The man who lived for peace, they said, well, he made peace between Egypt and Israel after fighting Israel and showing that Egypt had great military capacity and ability to surprise them too. He shook hands with them and made a peace deal with Israel, and then he got murdered by Muslim radicals at a victory parade, effectively. Now, National Geographic produced this map in 1947, where before there was a state of Israel, and the whole place was called Palestine at that stage. Now, the British then decided, because this had all been under Ottoman Empire for centuries, and the British took Palestine, Jordan, all those areas, whereas the French took Syria and a whole lot of the northern territories. And the British then decided to divide up the territory between the Palestinians and the Jews, and there's a whole lot more to come on this, but the British had promised the state to both the Arabs and to the Jews. So Balfour Declaration, they promised it to the Jews if the Americans could be brought into First World War on their side, but they also promised it to the Arabs through Lawrence of Arabia during the Desert War and First World War. And so the British had a difficult position. They were stuck in the middle, trying to keep these two parties aside and getting targeted by both. So in the end, they handed over to the United Nations, who divided up the state of Israel into these territories will be for the Palestinians, these will be for the Jews. And nobody was happy with the arrangement. And in the end, Israel took most of the territory anyway by military means. So, question is, what is terrorism? Webster's Dictionary of the English Language, I'm talking about the 1828 dictionary, which we've got on our shelf, is a very fine Christian dictionary definition before political correctness. Terrorism is defined as the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce for political purposes. Webster's Dictionary defines terrorism as the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce for political purposes. A terrorist is defined in Webster's as a person who uses or advocates terrorism, such as an agent or partisan of the Revolutionary Tribunal during the Reign of Terror in France. So that's very straightforward. To terrorize is defined in Webster's Dictionary as to dominate or coerce by intimidation, to produce widespread fear by acts of violence, such as through bombings. Some historians trace the origin of terrorism to the Sicarii zealots of first century Judea, like Barabbas. The Sicarii daggers used by the zealots against Romans and Jews who helped the Romans, they would specialize in going into a crowded marketplace and slipping this dagger between somebody's ribs, killing them in the middle of a busy street. And they caused massive chaos. The zealots caused such destruction, and there was a Tarpeian rock, which was the traditional place in which traitors, as in Jews who collaborate with the Romans, would be thrown to their death. Barabbas was one of these zealots who had murdered during the rebellion. And they caused such havoc with the Romans that the zealots led to the uprising in 67 AD that led to the destruction of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple because of their murders of Romans. And this is their goal. The goal was to use terrorism to provoke overreaction by the other side so that they could then justify whatever they were doing amongst the people. And many of these zealots ended up on Masada, this hilltop fortress built by King Herod, where they were surrounded by the Romans, and just before the Romans broke in to seize them, they killed one another. They all committed mass suicide by agreement rather than fall to the Romans, so they were totally fanatical. To this day, officers of the Israeli Defense Force make their pledge of allegiance on Masada. Basically, they are building themselves on this idea that the zealots were an example to follow of absolute dedication. Of course, they were fanatical terrorists. One of the weapons of the zealots was rolling stones down upon the advancing Romans seeking to come up the hillside. Zealots of Zion, using the term Sicarii, the zealots. And the French Revolution is a classic example of terrorism. And interestingly, the Girondists, who started a lot of the terrorism, ended up on the same gallows they condemned a lot of other people to. They executed the king, King Louis XVI, who was a real reformer king, and they murdered his wife as well. The French Revolution has again and again used terrorism. It's been an inspiration to terrorists and communists through the ages. 2 Chronicles 19 verse 2 says, "Should he help the wicked, and loves those who hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you." Now, the Irish Republican Army are another example of terrorism historically. In the London Underground in 1885, the Fenians, Irish Republicans, exploded a bomb in the London Underground at Gower Street Station. You can imagine the chaos caused by, in a confined space, an explosion. And the conspiracy leaders were rescued from the police van under a railway bridge in Manchester, 1867. Again, terrorism being used, people from the crowd just firing without warning. And these are just some depictions of the chaos caused by Irish Republican terrorists in England in the Victorian era. When Fenian prisoners were being brought to Mountjoy, And then there was this diabolical Fenian outrage in 1867 at Clerkenwell, where the prison wall was blown down to help an escape of these Irish Republican terrorists. And these are depictions in London Illustrated News. Aftermath, the Fenian explosion, Corporation Row, demolishing whole houses. And during the First World War, there was an Easter uprising in Dublin, where, using the post office as their headquarters, they fought against the British. They executed large numbers of English people, and as a result, the British mobilized artillery and tanks in Dublin to counteract the Irish Republican Army terrorism. And here the British were busy fighting at the Somme and fighting in France and Belgium against Germany, and then behind their back, the Irish Republican Army organizes a terrorist uprising which caused such havoc. There was whole areas in inner Dublin that were completely leveled because they provoked the British government to using artillery and tanks in the city. And these are the Black and Tans. These are the local British or Protestant Irish searching Irish Catholics who they suspected of being terrorists. All kinds of terrorist bombings being done. This case, 1939. Before the First World War, there was a spate of bombings in Ireland directed against the British. And the Irish were sometimes doing bombings in England, like here in Bristol, 1974. And the British police and the Royal Ulster Constabulary often responded with what was then depicted as brutality, but its reaction provoked by the IRA. And the IRA wanted to, frequently they would organize shootings in such a situation that would guarantee civilian deaths. A friend of mine who was involved in Londonderry Bloody Sunday was in the paratroops and said they were just mobilized, the British paratroopers, into Ireland, not given rubber bullets or tear gas or anything like that, or shields or gas masks. They were just had their normal FN self-loading rifles with hard ammunition, like NATO rounds, like they would use if they were fighting the Soviets. And the IRA mob marched towards them with a Catholic priest in front. And when they reached the British lines, they parted, and there, lying on the ground at the back, was an IRA gunman shooting straight down the middle into the British paratroopers. Then the whole crowd closed up again to protect him. So the British paratroopers did what they were trained to do. They opened fire. And that's Bloody Sunday. Massacre, which is what the IRA wanted. They wanted a bunch of civilians killed so they could blame the British for an atrocity they had provoked. That's what terrorism is. And Erie Neve, who is a personal friend of Margaret Thatcher, was murdered in a car bomb attack, actually in Westminster. Margaret Thatcher actually heard the bomb blast and looked out a window to see this. Erie Neve murdered by the IRA on the ramp in the House of Commons, and coming out of the car park, mercury tilt switch bomb used in the car. And the IRA has been good at bombings. Here's the bombing of Manchester and the fire at the Glasgow airport. Lots of terrorist attacks that have been used at different times, like on this occasion at the airport in Glasgow. The IRA specialised in doing all kinds of attacks. And then there was the Muslim terrorist attack on the Lockerbie aircraft, and this came from Libya. But 1988, the Pan Am 747 jumbo jet crashed in Lockerbie, killing a whole lot of civilians on the ground as well as people in the plane, of course, a bomb on the plane. And that's just another example. So IRA terrorist Muslim bombers were the main cause of bombings on the British mainland. And destruction caused by Pan Am Flight 103. A lot of people died in that. Not just people on the plane, but people on the ground. Well, where did all this come from? In 2014, I was a guest in Britain to speak on the anniversary of the First World War, and I went to the Imperial War Museum, and there they had an exhibit on Special Operations Executive, SOE. So in the War Museum, they had this exhibit on SOE, formed by order of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 22nd of June 1940. His directive to SOE was set Europe ablaze. To this purpose, the SOE was to conduct espionage, sabotage and reconnaissance in order to aid local resistance movements, which generally didn't even exist. They were basically to create resistance movements. They modelled the SOE on the Irish Republican Army. So SAE employed or controlled just over 13,000 people at the height of World War II. Also known as Churchill's Secret Army or the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, SAE headquarters were located in Baker Street, so often just referred to Baker Street. And its personnel referred to themselves as the Baker Street Irregulars. And today it's a tourist attraction, Special Operations Executive Headquarters, the Mayor of London, of Westminster, standing by this plaque, Secret Service, which supported resistance in all enemy-occupied territories. Well, although ostensibly they were meant to focus on countries occupied by the enemy, Italy and Germany, SAE also operated in neutral territories like Sweden, Spain and Switzerland and did assassinations there too. Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare, was appointed to take responsibility for Special Operations Executive. As Dalton left Prime Minister Winston Churchill's study, he was instructed, "Now set Europe ablaze." The SAE under Hugh Dalton did just that. And for security reasons, SAE was concealed behind names like Joint Technical Board, Inter-Service Research Bureau, and you'll find a lot of terrorist groups today continue to have innocuous names that don't sound very revealing. Handbooks and pamphlets on guerrilla warfare were produced. Weapons were developed for the guerrilla warfare in what was called Churchill's Toy Shop. They've often got some very nice euphemisms. Major General Colin Gubbins, Director of Special Operations Executive from 1943, had a wide experience of clandestine operations. He said in his own book, Rediscovering Irregular Warfare, that he put into practice the lessons he had learned from the Irish Republican Army during the Irish War of Independence. So SAE was deliberately based upon a terrorist group, one of the worst terrorist groups in history, the Irish Republican Army. And so silencers, daggers, all kinds of everything from throwing knives to chemical warfare. One of the early high-profile assassination operations was Operation Anthropoid, the assassination of the governor of Moravia and Bohemia, what today would be called the Czech and Slovak republics. Richard Reinhard Heinrich in Prague was targeted for assassination. This had disastrous consequences for everyone involved. And beforehand, they were warned by by the British military, you know, this is just going to cause a lot of trouble for people who have been unaffected by the war. And Churchill said that's the whole purpose. We want to provoke overreaction from the Germans so that we can justify a lot of what we're doing and to turn many of the people against their occupiers. So the fact that it would cause more harm than good was the whole aim. Now, Reinhardt was a very efficient leader and he was targeted for destruction. These were the two men trained, they were both Czech nationals, chosen to do this assassination. One of them was injured and therefore another one took his place, and their target was Reinhard Heinrich, who was someone of an amazing amount of skills intellectually, a great swordsman as well in fencing, officially the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and they threw a bomb at his car, and while his car was very heavily damaged and he was partly wounded and he was recovering for the first few days in the hospital, the doctors were amazed to see that although the wound should not have caused his death, but he did die, and they discovered later it was a biological warfare element in the bomb. So the shrapnel didn't kill him, but the biological warfare element did. And interestingly, the Czech Orthodox Cathedral, where the partisans or SAE operatives hold up, this church was virtually destroyed in the last-ditch stand that they made there, and now it's a place of remembrance for the heroes of the Heinrich Terror. I don't know if they were heroes, they caused massive loss of life. But SAE's key objective was to foment hatred and conflict between the populations of Axis-occupied countries and the occupiers, and to force the Axis powers, Italy and Germany in particular, to expend manpower and resources in maintaining control of the territory they occupied. The aims and objectives of SAE revolved around sabotage and subverting countries under control of the enemy. And Proverbs 17:11 says, "An evil man seeks only rebellion." Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. The goal of SAE was to mobilize murder and mayhem, much like the IRA's aim had been. And to this end, SAE created secret armies and guerrilla forces to sow murder and mayhem behind the lines. These are single-shot pistols designed to go up to a guard on duty and murder him so that you could steal his bigger weapon, so upgrade quickly. All kinds of belt knives through to various kinds of bombs, detonators, all kinds of poison and so on. These underground armies became a model for the Marxist liberation movements which tore Africa apart during the years of decolonization. The KGB built on the example of SAE in arming, training and fomenting terrorist campaigns throughout the world, including the Muslim terrorists who continue to plague our civilized societies to this day, right up to Hamas. They're all using tactics which SAE put into practice, which they learned from the IRA. Should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord, therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. Britain, Canada and the United States gave billions and billions and billions of dollars of high-tech weaponry, tanks and weapons and bombardment materials to the Soviet Union to save Stalin's Russia, and they betrayed the whole of Eastern Europe into the hands of these communists, and they sowed terrorism in areas that later on learned to use those tactics against them too. So SAE developed a wide range of explosive devices for sabotage, like limpet mines, shaped charges, time fuses. These are all weapons that have been used by our enemies like SWAPO, ZANU, ZAPU, MPLA, FRELIMO and so on. Like the sleeve gun. This is a one-shot weapon that could fit up your sleeve and fire a 32 caliber weapon meant to be at contact, that you basically walk up to the person and it slips down, and by using a muscle in your arm you can discharge the round into the person and then steal his weapon. So the sleeve gun is one of their tools of operation. The time pencil, used to give the saboteur time to escape after setting a fuse, relied on crushing an internal vial of acid which then corroded the retaining wire, and once that was corroded the device exploded. So these all these pictures I took in the British Imperial War Museum back in 2014, showing some of the different weapons they organized. And they justify this in that they were not able to face up the German army directly at that stage, and therefore they justified using terrorism because they wouldn't be able to win a conventional war against them at that stage. Plastic explosives, which they could shape and cut to perform any demolition task, Semtex and so on. Plastic explosive is inert. It requires a powerful detonator to explode, so it was safe to transport and to store. And they came up with plastic explosives, anything from car bombs to exploding rats. They literally purchased rats to kill and placed plastic explosives sewed inside these rats that they could then swing by the tail and hurtle at people for the rats to explode. So exploding rats was one of SAE's tactics. They experimented with lubricants laced with grinding materials for production or introduction into a vehicle oil system. You could just put in the fuel tank and it will later cause the engine to break down. Railway wagon axle boxes. They then put incendiary devices disguised as innocuous objects. So explosive materials was concealed in coal piles. So while the railroad people are shoveling in coal into the furnace to make the railroad, the locomotive go, one of these is actually a bomb and it's going to explode and cause who knows how much trouble to locomotives and fireplaces as well. Landmines were disguised as cow dung, and then they had the anti-tank sticky bomb carefully put together, and sticky bombs, you throw it and it's meant to stick onto wherever it lands, and hence the sticky bomb, and that would then stay on that part and create an explosion into the side of that metal object they could put it on. Ingenious limpet diving mines. Thanks to a new book, their antics and their inventiveness in developing new weapons has finally been disclosed. SAE really was very creative when it came to murdering people. Special Operations Executive also revived medieval devices like the caltrop, which is absolutely evil that anyone could even think of these things. Caltrops were designed now to burst tires of vehicles and injure foot soldiers, but they were designed originally to cripple horses and to make some areas impossible to cavalry. Absolutely disgusting. However you throw them, a sharp point's going to be sticking upright. And the British used these against the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War as well. Absolutely disgusting. This should be banned in any Geneva Convention, because caltrops, they cripple people or animals. Absolutely disgusting weapons. SOE produced crossbows to shoot incendiary bolts. They designed all kinds of bolts from the aluminium bolt above, and SOE had the crossbow bolt below, and then OSS is the American equivalent. Office of Strategic Services became the forerunner of the CIA. They had multiple warhead bolts. They had secondary steel penetrators. They had high explosive airbursts and all kinds of explosive area and explosive basic crossbow bolts. The advantage of these is they're silent to operate. They produced exploding pins, guns concealed in tobacco pipes, other exotic devices like the pencil pistol and the hidden knife, and then the pipe gun, so you could trigger it here while you're aiming your pipe at someone and shoot the person while apparently smoking a pipe. They then had all kinds of high explosive rounds, and the boot dagger was key, to come in and very thin that you can slide between people's ribs and so on. They also designed a penny cable cutting tool that it looked like a penny, but you could open up and use it to cut through wire. And then sneakers to leave false footprints, so it looks like somebody's barefoot, whereas actually they're not. And radio sets, of course, absolutely critical. I've seen some of these in the Espionage Museum in Washington, D.C. as well, but England's got these in the Imperial War Museum. All kinds of wireless sets were, of course, critical. And here's just a whole lot of demolition tools. You can see that they've got hidden in all kinds of things. Detonators, plastic explosive, wire cutters, do-it-yourself, how to blow up railway lines and so on. Semtex, which is the same kind of explosive used by the Muslim terrorists who took out the Pan Am flights that exploded over Lockerbie. And parcel bombs, letter bombs like these, where the moment the parcel bomb opens, the moment you open it, it brings the metallic paper in contact with one another, and that then sets off the bomb that's in the parcel. And they'd often put a whole lot of nails in just for shrapnel impact. This is a typical Unabomber bomb that's put into a suitcase. The moment you open a suitcase, it explodes. These things they learned from the IRA and they perfected under SOE. C4 plastic explosive. SOE supplied Marxist resistance forces throughout Europe, Southeast Asia and China with thousands of tons of military weapons and explosives and training in how to use them. So here it's just what they're providing: 300 Sten guns, 2,000 pounds of plastic explosive, mortar shells, all kinds of ammunition. This is supplying a Marxist terrorist group in 1945. Numerous military leaders at the time were horrified at the terror tactics used by Special Operations Executive and their practice of supporting the Marxist revolutionaries, like Tito's partisans, the communists in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Isaiah 59 verse 13 says, "In transgressing and lying against the Lord and departing from our God, speaking oppression and revolt, conceiving and uttering from the heart words of falsehood." And this is at Yalta. You've got the big three, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of America, Winston Churchill of Britain, and Joseph Stalin, working out how to divide up the world between them. And for evil, it would be hard to beat what these three did. Even before the Tehran Conference of 1943, SOE had stopped supporting the royalist government in exile of Mihailovich in Yugoslavia and channeled most British support to the communist partisans of Joseph Broz Tito. And what the British did in supporting the communists, the Americans and OSS replicated. They would not support royalist and nationalist forces. They would only support communist forces. And this is pretty standard, and they admit it. This is not a theory. This is a fact. And Yugoslavia was a creation of the Versailles Treaty. Well, Germany gave independence to different groups like Croatia and Serbia and so on. But now SOE worked to bring Yugoslavia back under one unified government, which was a terrorist government of Broz Tito. Here, wounded Yugoslav partisans are transported by ox cart to a field hospital, and American airmen are being transported on these wagons also in Yugoslavia. Shadows on the mountains, the Allies, the resistance, the rivalries that doomed World War II Yugoslavia. Rivalries indeed. They call themselves beacons in the night, but I don't know that they were beacons. They were helping destruction and nighttime to come over the whole of Yugoslavia with OSS and Tito's partisans. Tito's partisans, it would be more accurate to say Tito's terrorists. Major James M. Inks spent 3 months with Draž Mihajlović and his Chetnik guerrilla forces behind the lines in Serbia. And Serbia was a kingdom beforehand, and the Kingdom of Serbia was betrayed in the hands of communists as a result of SOE in the Second World War. General Draž Mihajlović was Yugoslav war minister and he is commander-in-chief of the Chetnik resistance, who were not being supported by the British. They preferred to support the communists of Tito instead. So Draž Mihajlović was betrayed, the Chetniks were betrayed, and they've even got Hollywood films depicting the Chetniks in a very nasty way and glamorizing Tito's partisans or terrorists. And so many of Tito's forces were fully armed by the SOE of Britain or of OSS of America. And so all the sufferings that people in Yugoslavia suffered, and Bill Bathman documents out, was one of the worst communist countries after the war. And it didn't have to fall in the hands of the communists. This was deliberate policy of SOE. So Tito became the dictator of Yugoslavia, and great brutality against the churches in Yugoslavia, as documented by Bill Bathman, for example. Should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. Tehran Conference, they agreed to the development of the United Nations, not enough to betray the whole of Eastern Europe into the hands of the communists, but they also worked out the UN, who continues to cause grief to this day. And the Tehran Conference was held in the Soviet embassy in Tehran. Now, Iran had been a neutral country, which Britain and America invaded in order to create a safe channel for Allied weapons going to the Soviet Union. Just like Britain and America invaded Iceland, another neutral country, to enable aid to go to the Soviet Union. So this talk about, you shouldn't violate neutral countries and unprovoked aggression, well, they were happy to do it to help the Soviets. And these are the evil trio. As Joseph Stalin observed, the death of one person is a tragedy, but the death of a million is just a statistic. Pretty callous character. So here are the Western allies with Arab leaders, and you can see in Greece, both the British Special Operations Executive and the American OSS favored the communist Elas guerrilla forces, effectively provide all the weapons which the Marxists used in the Greek Civil War that immediately followed the Second World War. And you can see where they called the liberation of Greece, but they didn't liberate, they betrayed Greece into the most evil, destructive civil war, which had huge amounts of atrocities against civilians, by continually giving Elas, or the communists, most of the weapons. And these are some of the women guerrillas of Elas who did a lot of hideous atrocities, very anti-Christian. And you can see the British influence, the kind of uniforms, berets, the weapons they're carrying. And so the British SOE is providing them with the weapons which was later used to enable the communists to cause tremendous destruction. Here you can see a first model M3, which is an American submachine gun provided by OSS. And the occupation of Greece was led to this hideous civil war, massive destruction of life, and the Allies caused the civil war, which was even more destructive than the Second World War when it came to Greece. And here they're using British 25-pounders. The Greek Civil War, strategy, counterinsurgency, and the monarchy. Children of the Greek Civil War. And here's a monument to Elas, World War II Greek resistance forces who were communist terrorists. And there's no other word for it. In Albania, SOE and OSS agents support the communist partisans of Enver Hoxha, who turned Albania into the most brutal Stalinist dictatorship after the war. I've ministered in Albania, and Enver Hoxha was one of the worst dictators ever. He didn't just murder lots of Christians, banned the church, wiped out every last minister, destroyed every single church, the most atheist country in the history of the world. He banned cats from the capital city as well. All dictators hate cats because cats don't obey orders. Joseph Stalin and Enver Hoxha, birds of a feather. Enver Hoxha brought about real communist, atheist indoctrination to such an extent you had to worship the state and worship the party leader. And it was so total. To go to Albania, you couldn't believe how atheistic the entire country became. And Enver Hoxha got his weapons from Special Operations Executive, and Enver Hoxha was supported by OSS. And so at the end of the Second World War, far from fighting for freedom and liberation and Western Christian democracy as the propaganda went, they betrayed half of Europe into the hands of Stalinist communist oppression. And when I started doing Bible smuggling behind the Iron Curtain to Eastern Europe, I had people asking me, why did you betray us? And I said, what do you mean, betray you? Well, you Westerners, you said you're fighting for democracy and freedom. Well, we never got any democracy and we never got any freedom. And the people in Romania, East Germany, Poland, they started to tell me the horror stories of what the West did. And Yalta is the swear word in Eastern Europe. Well, Special Operations Executive was a massive state-sponsored terrorist operation. John Keegan, the historian hailed as the foremost authority of his generation on warfare, British military historian, wrote, "We must recognize that our response to the scourge of terrorism is compromised by what we did through Special Operations Executive. The justification that we had no other means of striking back at the enemy is exactly the argument used by the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof Gang, the PFLP, the IRA, and every other half-articulate terrorist organization on earth. Special Operations Executive besmirched Britain." And it did. It was basically, they set the example, and then a lot of British war films glamorized this terrorism and murders and car bombs and assassinations. And the British led populations around the world, within Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, Rhodesia, they followed the example. I mean, you're saying this is a wonderful example to follow, so you can't blame ZANU-PF when they start to do exactly the same thing as the British glamorized in their movies and had told the whole world this is how we fought back when we weren't able to face the Wehrmacht head on. We did these terrorist tactics. And whether it's in Egypt, car bombs, attacking of churches, all of these attacks around, whether it's Boko Haram in Nigeria, they're following the example of Special Operations Executive, who were deliberately built upon the example of the Irish Republican Army. And so I've seen terrorists at work all over Africa, 40 years serving persecuted churches in 8 wars, 38 countries, and the roots of all this terrorism you can take all the way back to Second World War, Special Operations Executive, Winston Churchill set Europe ablaze, and their deliberate attempt to copy the Irish Republican Army. To target buildings like this in Nairobi, I mean, this is another example of, well, the British set the example of this, and to condemn terrorism today is a bit foolish. Many authorities claim it's very difficult to define terrorism. No, it's not difficult at all. Webster defines the terms very clearly. The use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce for political purposes. But as many government policies would fit the dictionary definition of terrorism, they prefer to pretend that there's a problem defining the terms. The Lancaster bombers taking 14 tons of high explosive bombs to bomb cities in Europe, does that not fit the definition of terrorism? Yes, it is. And so they don't want to accept the definition of terrorism in the dictionary because that would condemn their own activities. What about, what's the worst sea disaster in history? Many people say the Titanic, because there's a big film on it. But no, not even close. The Willem Gustloff, which was sunk by a Soviet submarine, this is a hospital ship filled with refugees, all civilians, over 9,000 civilians, 5,000 children amongst them, torpedoed by the Soviet Union. The submarine commander got an Order of Lenin award for sinking this refugee ship, like a hospital ship, which was filled with civilian refugees needing to flee from the Red Army. And then you look at the terrorists who blew up the Palestinian headquarters. 1946. What terrorists are they talking about here? Have you heard of the King David Hotel bombing? Yes. Okay, King David Hotel bombing. This is in Jerusalem, and because a lot of British mandate leaders were living there, and a lot of military people as well, the King David Hotel was targeted for terrorism by the Irgun terrorist organization. And here's the bombing. I mean, does this not look reminiscent of a lot of the bombs of the IRA. And bombing of King David Hotel, and terrorist blast British headquarters. And I mean, what terrorists they're talking about? 14 British officers victims of bomb plant by Jewish terrorists. Interesting, they put inverted commas around Jewish terrorists. Well, what else could they be called? They were terrorists. You don't need inverted commas around it. And here's 22nd of July 1946, King David Hotel blown up. But why would you condemn this as terrorism and not condemn when Special Operations Executive was doing the very same things throughout Europe? And so, but now the British are the targets of this, and so this is the terrorism they modelled and inspired and uprooted a tree from the bomb blast. So the Jewish National Military Organization of Erez Israel organized terrorism against the British, who were mandating the territories and who they saw as a stumbling block to them getting their full independence. So here are terrorist Irgun weapons discovered by British forces in Palestine 1946. Very similar to the kind of things we might get from the IRA or wherever else. So the British initially had the plan that the Jewish state would be Jewish Palestine, and then the Arab Palestine would be Transjordan. So Jordan and Israel were at one time one country, and now the British idea was two. But then there was a compromise made where they had a lot of Palestinians on the West Bank as well. The State of Israel was born out of terrorism, actually. They murdered a lot of British officers. They garroted them, hung them from British officers, hung from trees, garroted with wire, blown up. And here's a book on the revolt. Menachem Begin, who became Prime Minister of Israel, he was one of the terrorists who blew up the King David Hotel. And so the first Prime Minister of Israel was actually a terrorist by definition. And here's some of the Zionist leaders arrested by the British for their targeting of British soldiers in terrorist manners. Menachem Begin, 1948, the leader of Irgun. So, his wanted poster, and then Prime Minister of Israel. Now, one must condemn Hamas. Hamas are a terrorist organization. But it would be fair to just acknowledge the British have had their own terrorist organization, SAE. The Americans have had their own an OSS and a CIA. And so has Israel. Israel's first Prime Minister was a member of Irgun, who did terrorist operations of murdering civilians and British off-duty officers and blowing up a hotel. And here's the commemorative plaque. This hotel housed the British Mandate Secretariat as well as Army headquarters, and Irgun fights to order the Hebrew resistance movement plant explosives in the basement. Warning phone calls were made to the hotel's dispatch, and the entire western wing was destroyed, and to Irgun's regret, 92 persons were killed. Now this is the official poster that's put up there. Nevertheless, whether it was regrettable or whether they wanted them to evacuate or not, they did plant the bombs which killed 92 people. And so...
do you know that even to this day, well, the BBC refused to acknowledge the Hamas guys as terrorists?
Well, that's pretty foolish. The thing is, the dictionary definition of terrorist is so clear. They are terrorists, and you can only call them terrorists. But then, if you accept that, you've got to accept that a lot of what our governments have done are also terrorists.
They prefer to use the term militant, but I mean, a terrorist is a terrorist.
A militant doesn't decapitate babies. And what Hamas has done in this recent attack can only be called terrorism. We just need a balance to recognize that many of the people accusing others of terrorism have been guilty of it themselves, and one just needs a balance. Now here's the Irgun knife designed to slide between the ribs of some British soldiers occupying Palestine. Terror out of Zion. This is speaking about the deadly shock troops of Israel independence, and from 1929 to 1949. And they did use terrorist tactics to bring about the British withdrawal and that they could take over. Now, basically, it's a lot of hypocrisy. When we bomb civilians, it's strategic bombing or saturation bombing. When our enemies bomb us, it's terrorism. Government is organized crime with better public relations. The French Revolution was one of the most influential events of modern history, and they taught me at school the French Revolution is something good and wonderful, and democracy grew out of the French Revolution, which is rubbish. French Revolution was just terrorism, it was evil. The 10-year period from 1917 from 1789 to 1799, when France went from a monarchy to a republic, to the reign of terror, to dictatorship, was one of the most tumultuous times in European history. And it is you could say, it is the master example of all revolutions since. A lot of myth and romantic legends have been written about what many politicians would like the French Revolution to have been. But the reality was the French Revolution was a monstrous horror. It was a time of terror. And it's in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity, or death, over 40,000 people lost their heads to the guillotine. 300,000 people were publicly executed by firing squads, drownings and other methods of mass murder. And ultimately millions died in the 25 years of war and upheavals that resulted from the French Revolution. And this has been the model for the Soviet revolutions, the Cambodian revolution, the Zimbabwe revolution, so many others. Prisons where people were locked up for no other reason than they were part of the nobility, and then taken out and murdered for no good reason except for the fact that they belonged to the wrong social class. But the people who murdered a whole lot of others end up on the same wagons taken off to the guillotine themselves. The people who executed Louis XVI ended, like Robespierre, ended up in the guillotine themselves. And the Queen, 37-year-old Marie Antoinette, was dragged through the mockery of a trial, and she was guillotined the next day. And this inspired Charles Dickens's monumentally important book, A Tale of Two Cities. And this book was once given by Margaret Thatcher on the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. She gave a first edition, leather-bound copy of A Tale of Two Cities to Francois Mitterrand, President of France, saying, read it and discover why the French Revolution was totally unnecessary. And Margaret Thatcher had a sense of the historic nature, and her protest was very brilliantly done. Tale of Two Cities shows the difference between London in the grip of revival because of the Wesleyan and Whitfield evangelism, and Paris in the grip of secular humanism. And it's a tale of two cities, a tale of humanism versus Christianity. Very powerful, and still well worth reading book. The best book on the French Revolution I've ever read is Robespierre, Inside the French Revolution by Otto Scott. And reading it, you've got to pinch yourself off and you think, it's like it's describing South Africa and Rhodesia and Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, and it's describing China and Russia, and describing the BLM riots in America. This is the prototype for all revolutions. And Robespierre is the prototype for Vladimir Lenin and Mao Zedong, and people like Julius Malema and so on. Robespierre is the classic revolutionary. And they go from anti-religion to making a state religion. And of course, bombings, like what the IRA did in Britain, and the Great Uprising in Dublin, the Easter Uprising in 1916, and SAE, and the financing of terrorism. Just interesting how groups terrorize the world and how they are funded by different banks. And right now, what George Soros funds, for example, and what the Rothschilds have funded, absolutely shocking. And the bombings of cities and the upheavals in Northern Ireland, for example. So for the last 41 years, as a missionary concentrating on serving persecuted Christians, evangelizing in conflict areas, I've been exposed to Marxist and Muslim terrorist groups. I've been in their bases, I've sat down with them, I've spoken with them, I've debated them, like here, ZANU in Zimbabwe. And by the way, this character told me I couldn't take a picture of the bridge. So I asked if I could take a picture of him. Then I asked him to just move a bit to the left. And after a while, I got a picture of him and the bridge. This chap, you can see with the World Missionary Press Gospel booklet in his hand, How to Know God. These are different terrorists we've met. And the reason why this chap doesn't have a shirt is actually I bartered a digital watch for one of his terrorist shirts. And you wonder how I ended up with different types of terrorist caps here in our display cabinet. Well, we've got a lot more than that. Full uniforms, and some of them bartered from these characters. I ended up being interrogated by the Central Intelligence Organization in Zimbabwe shortly after this, because I've been preaching to these men on they were speaking about, I have a Bible, and he lifted up A War of Liberation, there's my Bible, and I said, but your God is Robert Mugabe, and he's going to die one day. And then what? He's going to face God. And I gave a whole lot of examples like this, and one of them went and radioed, and the CIO ambushed us on the way down from this Gook Hill near Matari, this in the Manika Highlands. And next thing, we were being arrested and interrogated because apparently I'd threatened the life of Robert Mugabe by saying one day he's going to die, which of course historically is true. I mean, 100% of people will die. It's statistical and immovable. There's a whole lot of these weapons that we've handled of this, like this Soviet SKS rifle with a Chinese pig sticker bayonet. I've engaged in discussion, debate and argument. I know terrorists, I know revolutionaries and guerrillas. I've been to battlefront with these folks and I understand what motivates them. And we've been involved in the conversion of the SPLA, the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, was once very Marxist with commissars. And we worked with them to such an extent they got rid of the commissars, brought in chaplains, got rid of the red star on their berets, and ended up with the cross. And I've been in the mosques, at terrorist bases, and on their radio programs, and in their houses. Even in Athlone, just across the freeway, there's a radio station called Radio 786. It's a Muslim radio station. They've got Intifada, pro-Hamas posters on the walls, and I've been in there having radio programs on blasphemy, pornography, abortion, many things that we agree on opposing. And yet you can see they totally support the Intifada and Hamas and Hezbollah and so on, and it's at that radio station. I've been on their stations and I've been in their homes. From my observations, terrorists are motivated by fanatical hatred, by intense rage, by deep-seated anger. Just take this EFF quote: "A revolutionary must become a cold, killing machine motivated by pure hate." That's a quote straight from Che Guevara. They're also motivated by pragmatic prospects of attaining political power through terrorist tactics. Many of them are just pragmatically Marxist because they want to get power, and this seems to be a way of getting power. Like take Hitler Hunsvi. This is a dentist who became one of Mugabe's top people for the land invasions. He used to have people he didn't like strapped into his dentist chair and drill their teeth out without anesthetic. So this is one of the main people who led the farm invasions in the year 2000. They're motivated by greed, perceived opportunities for revenge, and opportunities for looting. Terrorists are also motivated by lust for power, and frequently they're motivated by ignorance. The hostility, the rage, the anger that can lead to burning down of, for example, this town hall in Bloemfontein, destruction of huge amounts of property, burning, stoning, looting, necklacing. This is terrorism. Of course, many will quote from the writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, or from Mao Zedong, or even Voltaire, Rousseau, and Robespierre, for some kind of philosophical support for their violent tactics and their revolutionary aims. When I was captured by Marxists in Mozambique, taken by these MI8 helicopters into interrogation, the first thing I was told by the interrogator as I was walked into his interrogation office in Mashav was, "I am the devil." I said, "You're not the devil." He said, "Oh, I'm the devil. I'm not only a Marxist and a Leninist, I'm a Stalinist. I was trained in Czechoslovakia." Well, how do you respond to that? So I told him I'm a Christian. He just spat out, "I hate Christians." And so he went into a tirade against Christianity, telling me how Jesus was the first communist and the early Christians were the first communists, from each according to his ability to each according to their need and so on. I said, I can't agree with that. And I started to give him biblical explanation of Acts and said, if you believe Jesus was the first communist, why are you persecuting Christians? Why are you banning Bibles? If it preaches communism, you should be wanting to promote it. So he then went on a tirade against capitalism. And so I gave him a lecture on the French Revolution, and then he gave a tirade against Margaret Thatcher. So I started to speak about free enterprise, and we swapped lectures about 6 hours. And I thought I could do this all day. It's much more pleasant than having your toenails ripped out and being charged with electricity. So fortunately, many Marxists like arguing history and politics. So this interrogator allowed me to sidetrack him into a whole lot of lectures. But I am the devil, that kind of mentality. Now, you think of how many people really like Nelson Mandela and described as a Christian gentleman. Yet he was a member of the Southern Communist Party, and there's KGB Colonel Joe Slovo next to him. Winnie Mandela, we will liberate this country with a box of matches and our necklaces, burning people alive, sort of thing. But what is that behind him? Is that not something that looks awfully communist? That's the flag of the Southern Communist Party. And you know, when this picture was published in the New York Times, they blanked out the background cover because they didn't want to give people the right idea by letting them see what he was standing for. But why are Christians idolizing people who were involved in terrorism? Do you remember when the bombing took place at the Boston bombing, 2013? And what did Obama say? Anytime civilians are targeted by bombs, it is terrorism, which I fully agree with. He's quite right. But of course, he's the king of drone attacks. How many thousands of civilians did he murder with his drone attacks? He's the king of drone strikes. And most of that was collateral damage too. But he had earlier just said that Nelson Mandela is his model and his example. Well, if he's condemning terrorism, why is he idolizing one? And Muslims will quote from the Quran and from the Hadith or Muhammad as the authoritative foundation and inspiration for their jihad. Behead those who insult Islam. Doesn't that sound awfully tolerant to you? And here's a character in London who's just been trying, with a butcher's cleaver, tried to behead a British off-duty soldier. And he's literally got the blood in his hands. And of course you've got the Islamic Jihad and Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt who were involved in burning down churches and murdering people in the Islamic so-called Muslim Spring of 2011. Why would you do this? Why would you decorate a baby with grenades? I mean, it's not funny, it's not a joke. It's quite disgusting. I mean, if this is the father, that is abuse. In case you can't read Arabic, they put it in English as well. Islamic Jihad. Doesn't this look like a Quranic Bible study, a Quranic study group? It's no wonder William Muir, one of the greatest Orientalists of all times, concluded at the end of his long and distinguished career that the sword of Muhammad and the Quran are the most fatal enemies of civilization, liberty and truth, which the world has yet known. An unmitigated cultural disaster parading as God's will. Those few Irish Republican advocates of terror that I've interacted with have evidenced a mixture of Catholicism and communism in their deranged thinking to justify bombing military and civilian targets and crippling Catholic apostates for collaborating with the enemy by kneecapping. They would shoot especially girls in the kneecap for dating a British officer or something like that, or drill out the kneecap with a drill. Kneecapping was not something they did to Protestants, it's something they did to Catholics who were apostates, much like the Nicholas murders in South Africa were done by the ANC to people in the townships who they reckoned were collaborators or compromisers. You can always tell when you're in a Catholic area in Ireland. They've got crucifixes and statues of Mary and so on. This is where the IRA love to gather, the Red Devil Bar. Now I think that shows they were not really true Catholics as much as they were worshipping the Red Devil. I was a guest of Ian Paisley of Northern Ireland, staying behind me, in 2005 when we were preaching in downtown Belfast in front of the Queen Victoria statue in the City Hall of Belfast, and these big megaphones here were so effective people could hear half a kilometre away clearly what we were saying, open air preaching. Well, I asked Ian Paisley, are you doing any evangelism amongst the Catholics? And he said, would you like to join our door-to-door evangelism man? And next day his man turned up to pick me up and take us door-to-door. And I asked him, do you get threats? He said, well, I grabbed him, hooded him, bundled him in the back of a van the other day, and he ended up in a underground basement where they threatened him that if you continue to evangelize Catholics in this Catholic neighborhood, Falls Road, we're going to kneecap you. And so he told me that, stopped the car, and then walked up the path, knocked on the door to share the gospel of John with a Catholic family. So the people in Northern Ireland are tough. Now, how do you like this? 1939 Communist Party Convention, Chicago, United States of America. You can see this is Abraham Lincoln, biggest idol. Can you see on the left? It's Lenin, and on the right, can you see that Stalin? Stalin, Lenin, Lincoln. The trilogy or trinity of the Communist Party of the USA. And Abraham Lincoln is an idol for Marxist revolutionaries all over the world. Not only in Cuba do they name schools and highways after Abraham Lincoln, but in America they've got this temple. How do you like this for idolatry? Is this a temple or is this a temple? It says it's a temple. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. And what is he sitting in? A throne. That's not a chair, that's a throne. It's an imperial Roman throne, and it's got the fascist symbols that Mussolini used, which are on all Italian aircraft in the Second World War. That's what he's resting his hands on. Abraham Lincoln, the Emperor of America. And there's a lot of books that tell you how Abraham Lincoln was actually a friend of Karl Marx, and Karl Marx was a great advocate and PR campaigner in Europe for Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln and Karl Marx had a lot in common, and they've got an unfinished revolution. I've got the book Lincoln's Marxists, which run through a whole lot of these very evil 48ers, people who were involved in the 1848 revolutions across Europe. 1848, out came the Communist Manifesto, and many of the revolutions they organized in Europe failed, and to escape the guillotine and the noose in Europe, many fled to America and helped form the Republican Party. You wonder why the Republican Party's got a red tie. Well, they started out communist. I know these days they're the opposite, and the Democrats have got the blue tie, who now should have the red tie. But originally, the Republican Party under Lincoln was very communist, and they had a lot of 48ers who did many of the atrocities against the civilians of the South, who they just saw as bourgeois enemies. And Lincoln never punished his war criminals, he just kept promoting them. Well, Karl Marx declared the first battlefield is the rewriting of history. And this Communist Party in the USA, and you get people marching for communism around the world. How do you like this picture? What do you think? This is the mother of Justin Trudeau. That's Justin Trudeau as a baby visiting shortly after his birth, and here's little Fidel Castro. And just look at the body language, but look at the physical resemblance. Some people reckon that Justin Trudeau should be Justin Castro. And in fact, if you seek on Google, you'll see a lot of other pictures showing the resemblance between Justin Trudeau and Fidel Castro. So Castro's still dominating the world today. Now, obviously, we must understand our enemy if we want to defeat terrorism. Irish republicanism and Catholicism inspired most terrorist attacks in Britain, from Guy Fawkes's failed 5th of November 1605 gunpowder plot, remember the 5th of November, through the Irish Republican Army's bombings of the 1860s and the IRA's S-Plan, a sabotage campaign of the 1930s and 1940s, to the spate of parcel bombs, car bombs, pub bombings, targeting of soldiers, targeting of civilians, economic targets, bombing Harrods, Brighton Hotel, Hyde Park, stock exchange bombings. There's a stock exchange bombing in Britain, thanks to IRA. And although most assume that the IRA is primarily motivated by the republicanism and by Catholicism, there's been strong Marxist, revolutionary, anarchist elements to the IRA campaign as well. And since the Iranian siege of 1980 and the Pan Am Flight 103 Lockerbie disaster of 1988, Islamic terrorism has come to Britain too. So it used to be the IRA did most of the bombings, but now it's Islam. Since the 7th of July 2005, or 7/7, the IRA monopoly on bombs in Britain was taken over by Muslim jihadists. Therefore, you now need to understand Quranic teachings on jihad and Islamic history of terrorism. So how do you defeat terrorism? To defeat terrorism, you need to ensure that terrorism never pays. In Rhodesia, the Rhodesian Light Infantry ensured that terrorism didn't pay. They certainly turned a lot of floppies into stiffs. And they're called floppies because they were always flopping under the impact of FN bullets when they saw them. And Rhodesian Army did a spectacularly effective job of defeating terrorism. And if one wants to see an example of how to fight a terrorist war, Rhodesia did it. Also preemptive strikes going into the enemy territories, airborne assaults on them. That is the way get the terrorists to the point where they want to surrender. But it takes dedication, hard work, a civilian army. Every time you compromise with terrorists or negotiate with terrorists, every time you give in to the demands of terrorists or pander to the agenda of the terrorists, you greatly encourage them, you weaken your own position, and you expose your country and your people to more and far worse attacks in the future. In fact, friends of mine in Rhodesia said the reason why many black people turned from fully supporting the security forces to starting to compromise with the communist terrorists is when the Rhodesian government let Mugabe and Josh Nkoma out of jail and negotiated with them on the Victoria Falls Bridge in the railway carriage there in 1975. They start to think the white people are preparing to betray us and leave us. We must start to, we're going to have to make peace with the terrorists because they're going to be the next government. And so as long as the Rhodesian government did not negotiate with them and they maintained law and order, the local people supported the BSAP, the British South Africa Police and the Rhodesian Army, and did not support the terrorists. But when you start to pander to and compromise with and sit down and talk with them, you give them a respect they don't deserve. Now, General Pinochet of Chile understood terrorism as armed propaganda. Therefore, he deprived the terrorists of publicity. The people in charge of the media in Chile, when the military took over, was they'd put army officers as editors, they'd put sergeants as the journalists. The whole media was taken over by the military, and the terrorists could blow up a railway car. Nothing would get in the press. So without media coverage, terrorism in Chile died like a fire deprived of oxygen. So starved the terrorists of their support base. In the Malayan emergency, the British and Commonwealth forces, including the Rhodesians, enlisted the help of the local population by offering generous rewards for information leading to the capture of gangsters or terrorists who were disturbing the peace. And so you could get a lot of money for handing in these weapons. So if you knew where a cache was, it's a quick way of turning a quick buck. Those handing in terrorist weapons received generous cash payouts, and protected villages were established to remove the support that the insurgents had demanded from locals. In this way, the security forces separate the water from the fish, and the insurgency died out. The terrorists speak of, Mao Zedong says that the terrorists must be like fish in the water, and the community is the water. And so if you remove the water away from the fish, separate them, the insurgency dies out. You need to stop supporting the states, the ideologies, and the religions that inspire, fuel, and mobilize support terrorism today. Stop supporting those who support terrorism. How simple is that? Historically, this has included revolutionary France and Serbia. Serbia is a terrorist-sponsoring nation, which is why the First World War started. Serbia sponsored the terrorists who murdered the heir to the Austrian throne. And Austria had a beef with Serbia, and it was nothing to do with Britain and France. And we should all stay out of it. Certainly had nothing to do with South Africa and Rhodesia. We shouldn't have got involved on the side of the terrorists. And the Soviet Union has been sponsoring terrorists. We should never have served or support the Soviet Union, which the Prime Minister of South Africa in 1939, James Barry Hertzog, refused to declare war on Germany and said, this has nothing to do with Britain, it's nothing to do with South Africa. And when Smuts did a coup d'etat that kicked out our elected president without Prime Minister James Barry Hertzog, without a referendum, without an election, what's the first thing he did? He moved all the gold in South Africa to Simonstown to be secretly loaded on the USS Quincy, a American battleship that took South Africa's gold to New York, which paid for Lend-Lease, which saved the Soviet Union. And why would we want to save the Soviet Union? And Red China. Red China supports how many terrorist groups? Mugabe's trained in Red China's. Mugabe said, you farmers have degrees in agriculture. I have a degree in violence. I studied in Red China. Turkey is a terrorist-sponsoring country. To this day, they support Hamas. Saudi Arabia is a major terrorist-supporting nation. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. In transgressing and lying against the Lord and departing from our God, speaking oppression and revolt, conceiving and uttering from the heart words of falsehood. How do you defeat terrorism? Stop removing those who are resisting terrorism. Stop destabilizing and overthrowing those states that are resisting terrorism. Historically, this includes the United States and the United Kingdom, waging genocidal warfare against the two greatest opponents to communism and terrorism in history. No countries killed more communists or more terrorists than Germany and Japan, betraying nationalist China into the hands of Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army as well, and betraying Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Albania, into the hands of Marxist revolutionary terrorists This, pardon me, this led to also the betraying of the Shah's Iran into the hands of the Ayatollah Khomeini's crazies, and the betrayal of Batista's Cuba into the hands of Castro's communists, and the betrayal of Nicaragua into the hands of Sandinistas, the betrayal of Rhodesia into the hands of Mugabe's Marxist ZANU thugs. You wonder why we have terrorism in the world? Well, the West has been waging wars against those who were opposing communism and terrorism. And the British government admitted bombing 5 ships transporting Jews from Europe to Palestine between 1946 and 1948. They set up a fake group called the Defenders of Palestine to falsely claim responsibility for these bombings. So here I'm going into another aspect, and that is false flags. There's been a lot of terrorism that's actually been done by our Western governments for their own ends and what you call false flag operations. In 1954, Israel admitted launching a terrorist cell to operate in Egypt, planting bombs in several buildings, including the US diplomatic facilities, and leaving behind false evidence to implicate Arabs as the culprits. And this is called the Lavon affair. Lavon was the head of the, he is the Minister of Defense in Israel, Phineas Lavon, and when one of the bombs detonated prematurely, it enabled Egyptians to identify the bombers, and several Israeli agents confessed to this false flag operation. And the Lavon affair is all part of, by way of deception thou shalt do war. That's the motto of Mossad. So in order to frame Arabs and upset American-Egyptian relations, they set up a terrorist base that's meant to be Muslim Arab that actually was Mossad, bombing American restaurants, American Metro Gold Mayer cinemas in Egypt, bombing their diplomatic service to try and get the Americans to cut all contact with Egypt. And then there's Operation Ajax, a joint covert operation of the MI6 and CIA to overthrow Iran's first democratically elected government with a dictatorship. And so they hired Iranians in the 1950s to pose as communists and to stage bombings in Iran to turn the country against its elected prime minister. The Central Intelligence Agency was behind the overthrow of the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. And this coup replaced him with a dictatorship, Operation Ajax, which was a CIA MI6 operation. And so you wonder why Iran distrusts the West. An open secret. I don't know how many here saw the film called Argo, which is basically on how Hollywood helped the CIA to do a deception operation to get some American diplomats out of Iran. So thank you to the CIA for giving me this award and for giving me the chance to gain support through the use of propaganda for the upcoming invasion of Iran. Let's just hope people don't Google Operation Ajax and find out it was US actions which ultimately led to the hostage crisis in the first place. The Turkish Prime Minister admitted that the Turkish government carried out the 1955 bombings of a Turkish consulate in Thessalonica in Greece. So Turkey bombed their own embassy and damaged a nearby birthplace to the founder of modern Turkey, blaming it on Greece for the purpose of inciting and justifying anti-Greek violence. More than 4,000 Greek shops were sacked and plundered, 38 churches burnt down, 35 more churches vandalized, 2 monasteries and the main Greek Orthodox cemeteries were vandalized and destroyed. More than 2,000 Greek homes were vandalized and robbed. 52 Greek schools were stripped of their furniture, books and equipment. And this was what happened in September 1955 in retaliation to the bombings, which are false flag bombings done by the Turkish government against themselves to blame on the Greeks. And this lethal pogrom delivered the fatal blow to Greek community and the Greek Hellenism of Constantinople in just 7 hours. Remember, Constantinople was built as a Greek city, and this was to purge it of its last Greek influence, Greek Christian influence, and to enable Turkey to basically loot and destroy everything that's Greek and Christian. Now that was done by a false flag operation. Anti-Christian riots of September the 6th, 1955. So 68 years ago, the Greek minority in Istanbul was targeted in a crisis carefully fabricated by the Turkish security services. We must not rule out the possibility that even Hamas terrorist attacks like what we've just seen were manipulated by high-up forces of the globalists who have got another agenda. Because it's certainly not helping the Gazans. That's for sure. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan admitted that both he and American President Dwight Eisenhower approved the CIA MI6 plan in 1957 to carry out attacks in Syria, to blame it on the Syrian government as a way of effecting regime change. So you wonder why Syria doesn't trust the British and Americans. And here's another shocking false flag, hard to believe. The former Italian Prime Minister, an Italian judge and a former head of Italian counterintelligence admitted that NATO, with the help of the Pentagon and CIA, carried out terror bombings in Italy and other European countries in the 1950s to rally people's support for their governments in Europe. We had to attack civilians, people, women, children, innocent people, unknown people, far removed from any political gain. The reason was quite simple. They were supposed to force the people, the public, to turn to the state and ask for greater security. And so this is called Operation Gladio. These terrorist attacks were carried out in Italy, France, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, United Kingdoms and other countries in Europe, carried out by NATO security forces themselves. NATO's secret armies, Operation Gladio, where terrorism was orchestrated by the governments themselves on their own populations to justify increasing power and of course more taxes to take away more freedoms for their own population in the name of fighting the Soviet Union. It is full of lies and robbery. Its victims never depart. Nahum 3:1. The National Security Agency, or NSA of America, now admits that it lied about what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which just led to the Vietnam War, by the way. They manipulate data to make it look like North Vietnamese boats fired on US battleships, which would be extremely stupid. Little torpedo boats firing on a battleship, but this apparently started the war, the American involvement in the war in Vietnam. To create a justification for American involvement in the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident was fabricated and manipulated, and this was what Lyndon Johnson used to justify pouring hundreds of thousands of troops into Vietnam, bombing vast quantities of the country, Agent Orange to strip who knows how much vegetation out of the jungles and so on. And the Gulf of Tonkin incident was reported by US journalists as absolute truth and opened the floodgates for the Vietnam War, which led to massive amounts of profits by some very corrupt companies. And our Navy was out there shooting at whales, says Lyndon Johnson, for all I know. So this is the path to war, prefabricated incident, false flag in order to start America's involvement in the war. How many know about the bombing of the USS Liberty? 8th of June 1967, during the Six-Day War, fourth day into it, Israeli fighter jets and Israeli torpedo boats attacked the USS Liberty off the coast of Egypt with cannon fire, napalm, rockets and torpedoes. They started by jamming the ship's emergency distress channel, and then they targeted the communications ships to prevent the Americans radioing for help. Sailors attempted to escape in life raft were shot to prevent any survivors from escaping. Tremendous destruction of the boat. And you could see the hole of a torpedo in the ship, and this ship was really shot up, machine gunned, rocketed, and 34 American crewmen were killed, 174 were wounded. And this was just the casualties in the ship. Well, Admiral Thomas Maurer did an investigation into operation, and can you tell these two flags apart? Because Israel said they couldn't tell the difference between the two flags, and they couldn't tell the difference between this ship and that ship. They thought this was an Egyptian ship. And for 5 hours, dozens of pilots were bombing it, and they obviously tried to kill all on board. Now, it turned out Admiral Maurer, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, after a year investigating the incident, concluded the attempted sinking of the USS Liberty was a false flag attack, a failed false flag attack. Israel was attempting to blame Egypt for the attack, to persuade America to join in on their attack in Egypt during the Six-Day War. And President Lyndon Johnson was apparently in on it. He dispatched nuclear-armed fighter jets to drop nuclear bombs in Cairo, Egypt. And this was only stopped when this brave man climbed up and put an alternative radio aerial up that they could get the message out as to what was going on. And only once everyone in Europe was hearing the radio broadcast of who was bombing them in the ship, did President Lyndon Johnson finally order the American jets to return. And Lyndon Johnson said, I want that goddamn ship on the ocean floor. I mean, he wanted to get rid of the evidence and to blame the whole thing on Egypt. So deliberately attacked by Israel, but the American president was in on the whole thing. And all these sailors died as a result, 8th of June 1967. Jeremiah says, "This is a nation that does not obey the voice of the Lord, their God, nor receive correction. Truth has perished and has been cut off from their mouth." The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. Plato said, "Strange times are these in which we live, where old and young are taught falsehoods in school, and any person who dares to tell the truth is called at once a lunatic and a fool." Tolerance and apathy are the last virtues of a dying society, says Aristotle. So how do we defeat terrorism? Recognize that recent Western attempts to combat terrorism have been counterproductive, to put it nicely. Historically, with the destabilizing, collapsing, or overthrowing of each of those states which were resisting communism or radical Islamic terrorism, just think of the Arab Spring where they destabilized Egypt and Libya and Syria and caused so much havoc invading Iraq, or what they did to Rhodesia, what they did to South Africa, what they did to Southwest Africa. The cause of international communism or Islamic jihad have always accelerated, and numbers of terrorist attacks in the West have exponentially increased. President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, who's a medical doctor by the way, says terrorism is like a cancer. When you deal with the consequence rather than the root cause, it'll only spread faster. The West deals with terrorism in hypocritical ways. They call it terrorism when it hits them, and revolution, freedom, democracy, and human rights when it hits us. So they lied about Iraq, they lied about Libya, and they're lying about Syria. The United States is about to release evidence that the Syrian government used chemical weapons. Know that this is the same United States that fabricated evidence in the Mexican Wars, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Grenada invasion, the war on drugs, Panama invasion, sponsoring of the Iran-Iraq War, Desert Storm, the war on terror, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. We should not fall for this again. They've lied about everything before. Do you know the Spanish-American War was started by the USS Maine blowing up, which is now recognized as a false flag. America blew up its own battleship in Havana Harbor to justify in declaring war on Spain, taking the Philippines, taking Cuba and a whole lot of other things, Puerto Rico and so on too. If you don't come to democracy, democracy will come to you. The Boston bombing, my daughter Daniela was in Boston that very month, representing South African ice skating event when this horrible Boston bombing took place. And President Obama declared, any time bombs are used to target innocent civilians, it is an act of terror. To which I say a hearty amen, quite right. But he targeted how many civilians with bombs? And he idolized a man like Mandela who used bombs to target civilians too. So you've got to vote Democrat for kinder, gentler imperialism. If you don't come to democracy, they've got a way of democracy coming to you. Coming soon to a neighborhood near you, so that you can be free and liberated. I don't know if anyone's heard that apparently they've discovered oil in Namibia, and I was saying to them, they better watch out, America might decide to liberate them. Why do they hate us? New poll reveals it's because we're bombing them. I mean, I've got some people who said to me that the Muslims hate America because America's free, and I said, don't be ridiculous. Switzerland's free. Nobody hates Switzerland because they're not bombing them. Stop bombing people, stop economic sanctions, stop trying to assassinate their leaders, topple their governments and organize revolutions, and maybe people stop hating you. Do you remember this Time magazine cover? Total fabrication. The entire thing was a setup. This man was not being starved. He had a birth defect that led him to be this skinny. They took off his shirt. This barbed wire was not a camp enclosing them. They could walk around anywhere. The cameraman positioned himself on this side of a barbed wire fence they constructed that only stretched about a meter or so. They took pictures through this to give the impression of concentration camps in Serbia for the Muslim Bosnians. Started a war on the Serbians on the basis of that they tried to do a genocide, and it turned out to be total false flag, complete fabrication, complete fraud. George Orwell said the war is not meant to be won, the war is meant to be continuous. The war is an excuse to keep people controlled, subjugated, and of course to get a lot of money and power out of it too. Former MI6 agent Alistair Crook observed Saudi Arabia is founded on terrorism. and Saudi Arabia has been a primary supporter of radical Islamic terrorism to this day. The founder of Wahhabianism, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, argued all Muslims must pledge allegiance to a single Muslim leader, king or caliph. Those who would not conform should be killed. And the Wahhabians consider Shiite and Sufi Muslims as apostates worthy of death. And so the Wahhabians found protection under Chief Ibn Saud, after whom Saudi Arabia is named. From the very beginning, Ibn Saud and Wahhab used terrorism to instill fear and to force submission upon all those they conquered. In 1801, they massacred thousands, including women and children, in Karbala in Iraq. They destroyed shrines, and including the shrine of Amman Hussein, the murdered grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. British official Francis Warden recorded 5,000 inhabitants were massacred in Karbala by the Wahhabians. They seized Mecca with great violence. They destroyed centuries of Islamic architecture near the Grand Mosque. During the Second World War, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt invited King Abd al-Aziz aboard the USS Quincy, the same Quincy that had taken all South Africa's gold to New York, and docked in Suez Canal, where they cemented a secret oil for security pact. The Saudis guaranteed the Americans access to Saudi oil in exchange for American pledge to provide military assistance and training to Saudi Arabia. And ISIS is a modern incarnation of Wahhabianism that has dominated Saudi Arabia for over 2 centuries. Islamic scholars have noted the ideology of the Saudi regime is that of ISIS. Wahhabian Islam is fully in sync with ISIS. The House of Saud has exploited the same pernicious form of militant Islam under the United States watch. Beheadings and crucifixions are a mark of Saudi Wahhabianism. And the practice of ISIS of conducting public beheadings is consistent to the practice in Saudi Arabia, where of the hundreds of reported executions, all were carried out by public beheading, including princesses of the royal house who were beheaded for converting to Christ. Saudi money and manpower sustains jihad today. The previous head of MI6 reported he doesn't doubt that substantial sustained funding from donors in Saudi Arabia and Qatar have played the central role in the surge of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The Arab Spring chaos of 2011 was sponsored by donors in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates, all great allies of America. Turkey has also played a major role in supporting ISIS and al-Nusra, and by opening up their border for the so-called rebels. Most of the radical madrasas and mosques where domestic terrorists of the United States and United Kingdom are groomed and recruited were built and funded by Saudi Arabia. The refugee crisis stimulated by the wars in the Middle East are threatening to destabilize Europe. It's like a demographic time bomb. So supporting Saudi Arabia effectively supports terrorism. 15 of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi Arabians, as was bin Laden. Most of the private donors who were identified as those who funded operations were Saudi Arabians. Some American generals like Wesley Clark have observed, it can't be exploiting extremism and at the same time ask the United States to protect it. And Saudi Arabia is exploiting extremism. Even the United States State Department acknowledged that Saudi Arabia is the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. Yet, because Saudi Arabia is the chief purchaser of American weapons and invests in US government bonds and acts as a proxy for American covert operations, the US government has chosen to turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia, sponsoring most of the mayhem in the Muslim Middle East. Sir Richard Dearlove, the head of British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6 in other words, from 1999 to 2004, he reported in a conversation with Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the former Saudi ambassador in Washington, and the head of Saudi intelligence, a conversation just prior to 9/11. The time is not far off in the Middle East when it will be literally God help the Shia. More than 1 billion Sunnis have certainly had enough of them. A chilling comment that I remember very well indeed. Now, I'm not aware of a single James Bond film that's recognized Islamic jihadists as a threat to the realm worthy of attention of MI6. Have they ever had a single James Bond film where the threat was the IRA or a Muslim jihadist? Not at all. It's just, that they dream up some exotic, impossible, this journalist or this businessman or something are the threat to world peace, but never the people who really threat to the realm, like the IRA or the Islamic jihadists. Just looking at Facebook, this is a doctor in Britain who later became a jihadist in Syria, and it doesn't make you trust your medical doctors that good when you know that. And Islamic peace and tolerance at work in capitals all over the world. Under Sharia law, the woman is held 90% responsible for rape. Women have the power of enticement. Therefore, the victim of rape is beheaded, stoned, or hung in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, so the victim is the one who gets executed, because she's the one to blame. And here it is. This is an Egyptian Muslim Grand Mufti to Australia and New Zealand who says, a woman being gang raped, if you take uncovered meat, place it outside in the street or in a garden or in a park or the backyard without a cover, and the cats come and eat it, whose fault is it? The cats or the uncovered meat? The uncovered meat is the problem. If she's in a room, in a home, in a hijab, no problem would have occurred. In a state of unlawful sexual intercourse, the responsibility falls 90% with the woman. Why? She possessed the power of enticement. British and Irish settlers arrived in Australia as convicts. Muslims paid for their own tickets, so we have more right to Australia. This is what a Muslim in Australia and New Zealand, he's the Grand Mufti, has got to say. So the religionofpeace.com website, you can go on there, and it's up a lot more since, but since September 11th, 2001, they've documented over 31,000 deadly terror attacks carried out by the Religion of Peace. So Truth and Real History exposes propaganda, which is why I wrote the book Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, The Historical Roots and Contemporary Threat. And there's books out there on the South African land scandal and the Angolan war. To defeat terrorism, you need to counter their propaganda and their guilt manipulation campaigns with truth and real history. And understanding history helps us to counter the guilt manipulation and disinformation. You can only fight an ideology with a better ideology. Lies can be exposed by facts, and truth should not fear investigation. We need to understand Islam, we need to resist terrorism. And we need to resist terrorists physically. Terrorists are violent criminals. They're cowardly bullies who tend to flee when they're met with resistance, such as the St. James Massacre, when one of our missionaries stopped the attack by shooting back and the terrorists fled, which is why I wrote the book Security and Survival Handbook. Armed citizens frustrate terror tactics. Armed citizens save lives. Terrorists prefer unarmed victims. Ensuring that the general citizenry have the right and freedom to obtain firearms and training will do more to end sporadic acts of terrorism than anything else. When you've got a generally armed population who are ready and trained, like in Rhodesia, where our entire civilian population was armed, with a high population of a country being armed, trained and ready to resist, terrorism must fail. If you want peace, you must prepare for war. Switzerland is a very good example of an armed citizenry providing an effective deterrent to attack. When any country's got a plus on its flag, it's a positive sign. Switzerland is an island of sanity in a continent that has ripped itself apart in war, and yet they stayed safe and peaceful by armed resistance. You all know about William Tell. William Tell was forced to bow before a hat of his governor, and he refused to, so he was told to shoot an apple off his son's head with his crossbow, and he succeeded in doing it. And when he was asked, what are you doing with the other bolt in your hand? He said, because if I'd missed with the first bolt, I would not miss with the second, in your heart. And the governor thought that was pretty insubordinate, and so he ordered him arrested and sent to a prison. He managed to escape with his crossbow in a storm and shot the governor and started an insurrection that led to the founding of Switzerland. And William Tell was followed by William Farrell and Ulrich Zwingli, who have continued the Swiss tradition of love for liberty and of weapons too. They're good shots, they're good swordsmen, good marksmen as well. So I was traveling to a minister's conference in Switzerland, and I saw this shooting range. And as we got close, I said, is that a pistol range? And he said, no, it's a rifle range. Where they shoot from? The other side of the valley. The other side of the valley? How many shooting ranges do you know that would go over farmlands and roads? And they said, well, we're good shots. Well, I'm sure you are, but still. So there I was at a missionary's home, and I saw a young man sitting behind the table, and I said, are you in the army? And he laughed. He said, we all know army. Switzerland doesn't have an army. Switzerland is an army. How long does it take you to get ready for war? He said, I don't know. And I said, can I time you? What, now? Yes, starting now. 5 minutes, 20 seconds later, he was back, boots laced on, rifle ready, and his sister got so excited she pulled out another machine gun, and other youngsters there gathered a whole lot of other weapons. And you can see, First World War, Second World War, sort of Cold War down to now. So, and the other sister brought out a sword. So they had so much weaponry. And this is a student studying at college, and he's got his rifle and bayonet ready. And Switzerland is a country where sharpshooting is the national sport. And they've got very well-made weapons. And every side of the hills are alive with the sound of gunfire. Now, men must serve in the army, but if you're a girl and you would like to shoot, the government will give you an assault rifle and a crate of ammunition free. I mean, how's that for freedom? At school, they start with their rifles and they teach them gun safety all the way through. And the Swiss tend to win Olympic shooting competitions because that is the national sport and they're doing it at school all the way along. And you will see signs going around Switzerland that the people are fairly well armed. And the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker are out there on manoeuvres regularly. The dooms of King Alfred guarantee the right of all free men to keep and bear weapons for self-defense. Magna Carta 1215 guarantees the rights of all free men to keep and bear weapons for self-defense. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 guarantees the rights of all free men to keep and bear weapons for self-defense. So it's time for these historic rights to be restored. If you can't keep weapons, it means you're not a free man. My daughter Andrea came into my office once and just decided to put on some of the terrorist uniforms that I had decorated in the place and grabbed the flag and the crossbow. I didn't pose her like this. She just chose. I brought out the camera and I saw her getting dressed up in all these outfits. And it's important to teach your children to know how to aim to please. And again, I didn't give my daughter the sword. She just picked it up and started posing like a ballerina with it. And we climbed up Table Mountain for Krista's 6th birthday, and he is carrying his rifle around that he had just gotten. And this picture was published somewhere, and my wife was criticized for being an abusive mother, for training her child in horrible things like this. Well, in fact, it's obvious that this is a bit of a joke, but still, she wrote an article on why boys need wooden guns and plastic swords. And that's an essential part of any child's upbringing. That's in our Reforming Our Families book as well. But it's so important that you raise boys to be protectors, to those who are ready to protect their sisters, their mom, their future wife, and so on, that they must love weapons and know how to use those weapons effectively. Martial sports are key, whether you're talking about sword fighting, fencing, archery, air rifles. It's vital that we give the spirit of resistance. And so I think in raising youngsters, you want to teach them where's the off button for the TV set and use a whole bunch of weapons to find it. Family that shoots together stays together. And different combat shooting opportunities where we are going in the practical combat range and shooting these metal drop-down targets and so on. I think it's an important part of any upbringing, and whatever you do, you should show enthusiasm. Some of the women at one of our Great Commission courses after target practice, Bill Bathman with the Romanian AK-47 in Sudan, top of Table Mountain, hiking, karate, unarmed combat, sword fighting. These are all just useful techniques that we want to teach continually at our camps courses, that we are raising a generation who've got an aggressive fighting spirit and who are not just targets waiting to be victims. Do not be afraid of them, the scripture says. Remember the Lord, great and awesome. Fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. The desert tribes will bow down before him. His enemies will lick the dust. All kings will bow down to Christ. All nations will serve him. The kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. All nations will come and worship before the Lord. Ultimately, we can thank God for the victory that he gives through the Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Facts are stubborn things. We need to understand the context of our history, rediscover the real facts, the real people, and the real history, so we can counter Satan's deceptions of the nations today. And that's why we've written a lot of books on these issues, so that we can know the truth, because the truth will make us free.